not only because it resonates with my own particular convictions, but because I believe that a religious engagement with secularity is positively necessary. That's not simply so that we can all live together in some warm, cuddly, secular utopia, but rather because when we arrive at one point of consensus, the point that secularity is by and large good for us all, we cannot simply settle there. This is partly because some of the would-be advocates of secularity, who loudly espouse the equal playing field rationale, frequently slip into secularism, attempting to exclude from effective public debate those motivated by a comprehensive religious doctrine. You only have to read the comments over gay adoption or stem cell research to see that. But there's also a more positive reason, I would argue, for Muslims and others to engage positively with secularity. It is that secularity is anything but a done deal. Agreeing to abide by the rules of secularity leaves everyone, religious groups included, with two tasks. First, to design and modify those rules, and secondly, to engage in debates within them. I want to briefly take those two tasks separately. They correspond to, if you like, the process and the content policy, and doing so using a legendarily controversial example: abortion. Abortion law varies from one country to another, as do the means of deciding those laws. In Britain, it's decided by MPs who periodically vote by convention without party whip on whether to amend the 1967 Abortion Act. In the US, by contrast, the matter was decided by the Supreme Court, which ruled in 1973 that all state and federal laws outlawing or restricting abortion violated a constitutional right to privacy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The difference between these two modes of decision-making is significant, mildly, and it has been cited as the reason why abortion in the US is such an all-encompassing, make-or-break, near hysterical subject, where in the UK it is merely emotive and controversial. Whether one realises or not, and for the most part we don't, such modes of decision-making are formed by conceptions of the good, which are themselves formed by our own religious or other commitments. In the US, a decision that resulted in the subsequent termination of millions of pregnancies was made by 9 people, none of whom were Democratic representatives, and was justified by the 6th clause in an amendment that was originally proposed in 1866 to secure the rights of former slaves. Not surprisingly, opponents of the decision have objected that it lacks a valid constitutional foundation and have tried to argue that the issue should be decided by the democratic process and the state legislatures, as indeed it was before Roe. In the UK, by contrast, the decision is made by democratic means, with MPs given a free vote by convention because abortion, like other issues related to the start of life, is deemed to be such a strongly held moral issue that parties will not make a manifesto commitment about it. Accordingly, this special freedom of conscience clause irritates some who rightly claim that all political issues are moral issues. The point here is not to outline what is the right way for determining such an issue, still less to decide what abortion law should be. Rather, it's simply to suggest that even within a system of secularity, a system in which everyone agrees that the ultimate decision should be political, rather than, say, ecclesiastical, debated, rather than simply asserted, and respected, rather than violated, there is still scope for debating how we establish the process for arriving at that decision. Should such an issue be decided by democratic representatives? Should it be decided at a state or federal level? Should representatives be entitled to vote with their conscience in such matters, but not in others? If so, should that right be secured by legislation, or should it merely be a matter of convention? Can a constitution or an amendment thereto legitimately be used to pronounce on an issue like abortion? What are the merits of a written constitution in the first place? Each of those is a substantive issue which can only be adjudicated by drawing on substantive conceptions of the good. All such conceptions, whether rooted in a religious worldview or not, need to be heard in such debates. If not, a portion of society is worryingly disenfranchised. In the words of a political scientist, Jonathan Chaplin, based at Cambridge, where society is pervasively secularised, where public life and institutions are principally governed as if transcendent religious authority is irrelevant, it will in practice almost inevitably lean towards programmatic secularism. In other words, that's Sahin's term, secularism. So that's, in a sense, the first reason why I would argue that Muslim, Christian, Jewish and other religious beliefs need to engage with secularity, because, as I said, the process of secularity is not a done deal. There are still many substantive issues for debate and modification possibly, and indeed everyone should have a place at the table in that debate. The second point would be a rather more obvious one. It's to do with the content of policy. Much the same can be said regarding those who engage positively with secularity in terms of its content, engaging in a debate that takes place within the agreed rules. Staying with our contentious example of Roe versus Wade, it was a decision passed by the Supreme Court in 1973, and it judged that a mother may abort her pregnancy for any reason up to the point, quote, at which the fetus becomes viable, with the court defining viable as being potentially able to live outside the mother's womb, albeit with artificial aid. When abortion last came before the UK Parliament last year, MPs voted to keep the limit at 24 weeks for a similar reason. It hardly needs saying that these positions are based on very substantive conceptions of the good. The position that one adopts on abortion, for example, whether never, only in cases of severe fetal abnormality, during the first, second or third trimester at 20, 22 or 24 weeks, on demand or not, with the consent of 2 doctors or fewer, all those issues will depend heavily on the values one attaches to human life, dependence, autonomy and choice. The idea that it is legitimate to permit abortion up to the point at which a fetus becomes viable is based on a belief of what makes human life valuable, such as its capacity for independence and autonomy. Given that belief, that position on abortion is rational, but given foundations that are formed by different conceptions of the good, other conclusions are equally rational. It was perfectly rational for ancient Romans to expose unwanted infants, especially girls, given the value they assign to human life, especially female life. It's perfectly rational for modern Catholics to campaign for an end to abortion, given the way they understand human life. It is a myth, pure and simple, indeed worse, it's a confidence trick, to claim that one position is more rational than others' simpliciter. A position may be more or less rational, given its particular premises, but all positions, all public doctrines, are based on an element of faith. The point of this discussion, the second part of the discussion, once again, is not to adjudicate on the content of abortion law, any more than the previous one was to adjudicate on the process of arriving at that law. Rather, it's to repeat that even if we live in a secular system in which such decisions are debated in the public square and then respected by the public, there are still real issues up for grabs. It's vital, I would argue, that religious people, meaning those whose views on human and non-human life and worth are formed by their understanding, devotion and love of God, it's vital that they participate in such debates. Without them, they are much impoverished. They're likely to be tidier, of course, but at the expense of excluding valid views and, importantly, of disenfranchising them, those people who hold them. So in conclusion, I would argue that if we all agreed on the legitimacy of secularity, it would certainly be a positive start, but it wouldn't be an end. Secularity can be coloured by different ideologies as readily as any other public doctrine. What I think we need to stand alongside and engage with the liberal secularity that is such a clear and powerful voice in our society is an informed and respectful religious secularity, whether it be Christian, Jewish, Muslim or whatever else. The term religious secularity may sound as oxymoronic to us as secular clergy, but that doesn't make it any less valid or needful today.